Hi everyone, my name is Vaibhav Patel. I am a registered migration agent at Aussizz Group. Today we are going to discuss about the skills assessment for general occupations like software engineer, accountant, management accountant, taxation accountant, engineers like civil engineer or electrical engineer, then general occupations like marketing specialist or cafe or restaurant manager or nurse, or let's say trade occupations like chef or cook or motor mechanic and all those kind of occupations. So let's move to the overall understanding of the skills assessment and its requirement first. So why do we need the skills assessment? First thing is because any general skilled migration visa that any applicant wishes to apply for, they first need the skills assessment that is valid for a migration purpose. Now, the visa subclasses that you can use this for is not limited to these visas. However, generally most of the people use this skills assessment for subclass 189, which is skill independent visa, subclass 190 state nomination for 190 visa from any state, and subclass 489 family sponsorship as well as the state nomination for regional sponsorship, and the subclass, let's say 457 or subclass 186 or 187. Most of the occupations skills assessment for these occupations are used for any of these visa purposes. Now let's move forward to each categories. Now, as I mentioned, that there are many of skills assessments that we usually can go through, but however we are just going to discuss about some common occupations and common skills assessment authority that we come across on day-to-day basis. There are very few applicants who are usually applying for an assessment with other bodies, so that's why we are not even covering those ones in this live session. Now, under the skill assessment for migration purpose, there are, let's say, the assessment bodies are ACS, which is Australian Computer Society, which usually assesses the occupations for IT related occupations such as software engineer, developer, programmer, computer network and systems engineer, analyst, programmer, network analyst, ICT security specialist, and many more IT occupations like that. Now, second assessment body is CPA, IPA, or ICA. These three bodies assesses the same thing. They assess for accountants basically. So applicant can choose to go for any of this assessment body. There is no difference between the requirements. So the occupations that you can choose with these bodies is generally an accountant general, management accountant, taxation accountant, external auditor, occupations like this. Now the next assessment body is Engineers Australia. Engineers Australia usually assesses most of the engineering occupations such as civil engineer, electrical engineer, environmental engineer, engineering technologist, let's say structural engineer or electronics engineer, telecommunication engineers, and many other engineering occupations. The next occupation assessment body is VETASES, which usually assesses for general occupations, which is, let's say, a management occupation generally, which could be, let's say, a cafe or restaurant manager, for example, customer service manager, then marketing specialist, advertisement specialist, and corporate service manager, for example. So this kind of occupations. Now, obviously, this assessment body specifically, VETASES, assesses many occupations. So the list is quite extensive. So obviously, I'm just giving you a brief about what are the occupations that are covered from VETASES. But if you go through this occupation list on the DIVP's website and you find any occupation which against it says VETASES, so the VETASES is the assessment body for those occupations. Now NMEC, which is generally an skills assessment body for occupations like nursing, registered nurse, all kind of registered nurses, midwives, enrolled nurse. So they are the one who assesses the occupation and these occupations. And the last one is the Trade Recognition Australia, which is TRA. Now TRA assesses all the trades occupations such as cook, chef, pastry cook, baker, motor mechanic, plumber, plasterer, many more construction related occupations as well. So pretty much all the trade occupations and all the occupation which includes trades work basically. Now what we will do is we will go through each assessment body and see what occupations they assess and what is their requirement, general requirements, and understanding their requirements in detail. Okay, so let's go and understand the skills assessment requirement for from ACS. Now, the first assessment body that we have chosen is Australian Computer Society. Now, Australian Computer Society has two major sections. One is they consider as a Australian qualification, which is bachelor's or higher degree, and what the person needs to do in order to get a positive skill assessment if they have an Australian degree, and what the person needs to do if they have a bachelor's degree but which is overseas bachelor's degree or higher. Now, if someone holds a degree from Australia which has ICT major and it's highly relevant to the nominated occupation, then the person just needs the professional year certificate or 1 year work experience in that occupation or related to that occupation at least. And so it's quite simple. You just have to have a degree which is highly relevant to the nominated occupation. So whatever your occupation that you choose has to, your degree has to have those kind of subjects or those related subjects to that occupation. So for example, someone chooses computer network and systems engineer, then they have to have at least some subjects related to computer networking in their bachelor's or master's degree that they've studied in Australia. On top of that, they have to have at least a professional certificate or 1 year work experience in that occupation or closely related occupation. Now, the second way is assessing the bachelor's degree. So a lot of people are not aware that they can assess their bachelor's degree based on their overseas qualification. Now, if you do have an overseas bachelor's degree which is related to IT, then it depends on whether your bachelor's degree is ICT major or not, and whether the degree that you have studied is related to the occupation that you choose or not. So depending on that, there are certain things that changes. So we'll go one by one. So the bachelor's degree which has ICT bachelor's degree or higher equal to an Australian qualification. If it is ICT major and closely related to the occupation, then the person needs to have at least 2 years work experience. If the bachelor's degree or is ICT major but not related to the nominated occupation, then the person needs 4 years work experience in that occupation. Now, if the person has a bachelor's degree but which is ICT minor and but it's still related to the occupation that we have chosen, then the person needs 5 years work experience in the last 10 years or 6 years work experience anywhere in the past. Now, if the person has a bachelor's degree which is bachelor's or higher, an ICT minor, and also not related to the nominated occupation, then the person needs at least 6 years work experience. Now, if the person has diploma which is ICT major but closely related to the nominated occupation, then the person needs 6 years work experience. 5 years work experience. And if the person has a diploma or advanced diploma or associate degree, let's say, which is ICT major but not related to the occupation that they have chosen or they have work experience in, then they need at least 6 years work experience. Or let's say if someone does not really have any ICT qualification but they do have diploma or bachelor's in some other field, but they have got long-term work experience like 6 years or more of work experience, they can still apply for a skill assessment with ACS, which is a good thing. Now what they need to do is, on top of having the degree and the work experience, the person needs to provide the RPL form, which is writing the 2 projects in detail about what they did and how they acquired the skills over the time of, let's say, 6 years or 7 years or 8 years for the period that they worked in, and then explain at least minimum 2 projects in detail about what they did as let's say in their occupation and as an ICT engineer, or let's say software engineer or something, right? Now here ACS usually looks for, so from overseas qualification, yes, the first thing is they look at your degree, whether it's relevant to ICT or not, major in ICT or not. Second thing they look at is whether it is related to the nominated occupation or not. That is assessed based on your subjects that you've studied during your bachelor's and your work experience. Now, generally, a lot of people make mistakes in work experience documentation. So ACS does have a specific format where they really require you to provide the documents in that specific format only. So please make sure that when you apply for a skills assessment with ACS, you go through the assessment criteria as well as also go through the documentation checklist where you need to provide us a reference letter from your employer in specific format outlining certain details. like when did you start, when did you finish, what was your occupation during that time, and what duties you performed, and how many hours per week you worked. And the letter has to be signed on the company's letterhead. Uh, Now, let's move to the next occupation or next assessment body, which is CPA, IPA, or ICA. These three bodies are assessing the same occupations like accountant, management accountant, taxation accountant, external auditor, and the requirements are pretty much same, or I would say quite same. Now, what we need here to assess is that the person has to have at least a bachelor's degree or higher, and the degree that you have studied or the applicant has studied has to meet 7 core accounting knowledge areas. Now, generally, people who study in Australia usually they meet this requirement because those courses are already accredited by CPA or IPA or ICA. However, if you study something overseas, let's say someone studied Bachelor's of Commerce from overseas, now they want to assess the degree here. They can also assess the degree. Now, if CPA says okay, or if you apply with CPA and if CPA comes back and say, hey, you don't meet the 7 core accounting knowledge areas, they would give you an option to study those subjects by completing a foundation exam with CPA or going to the university or institute which is approved by CPA and completing those particular units only. On top of that, the applicant has to have proficient English, which is IELTS academic 7 each or PT academic 65 in each, or equivalent score in PTE or TOEFL or CAE. That's quite straightforward. Generally, people are not aware that they can assess in this assessment, or let's say assessments related to accounting. There are a lot of people not aware that they can also assess their bachelor's degree, and they could have applied for the PR based on the accounting pathway. So next assessment body that we're going to discuss is Engineers Australia. Engineers Australia assesses the degrees in majorly three pathways, I would say. Actually, there are more, but then we have just combined in one, 3 in 1 actually. So it makes it much easier for people to understand. Now, one is Australian accredited qualification pathway. So if someone, let's say, completes the qualification which is accredited by Engineers Australia itself, you simply hand over your degree and your passport and everything, and then you apply for your skill assessment, and then they assess your degree based on what occupation your degree has been registered for, or let's say whatever your major is in basically. So you get the skill assessment for that occupation. If you do want to apply for another assessment, yes, you can apply, but then you have to go for a third pathway, which is CDR or competency demonstration report pathway, which is non-accredited qualification pathway. We will discuss about that very soon. Second pathway is Washington Accord or Sydney Accord or Dublin Accord qualifications. So if your qualification is assessed or is accredited by any of these, if your country is participating in any of these accords, and if your qualification falls under that country's accredited qualifications pathways, and if your qualification basically is accredited under the Washington Accord or Sydney Accord or Dublin Accord, under any of these accords, then you can also apply for skills assessment by simply providing your degree and your passport, and that would meet the requirement. Now again, it's same as Australian qualification pathway, where if your degree is assessed or accredited only for certain subjects, you can only apply for that occupation. If you do wish to apply for another assessment, then in that case you will need to choose the third pathway, which is non-accredited qualification. For example, someone studied Bachelor's of Telecommunication Engineering, or let's say to make it easier, someone studied Bachelor's of Petroleum Engineering, but then they do not really have that occupation on the list, so they don't want to go for that. However, their degree is assessed under the Washington Accord, so they will only get the skills assessment as an petroleum engineer. But if they go under the non-accredited pathway, they can even choose some other occupation which is at least relevant but on the occupation list. So that's how some people may choose to go for another assessment under the non-accredited pathway. Now, under the non-accredited qualification pathway, the applicant needs to write down the CDR report, which consists of 3 projects that they have done during their studies or work or industrial training, or let's say as an intern. So any of this work that they have done, or let's say any of the projects they've done during their studies or work or internship or industrial training, they can include those projects that they've done and write down in detail that what they did in each project. They have to write down at least 3 projects. Each applicant needs to provide three reports about what they did and three different reports on three different topics, but at least related to that occupation. So if someone chooses a mechanical engineer, your projects has to be related to mechanical engineering, all of those three. Now, in this pathway, the important things to look after is, the first thing is, yes, CDR report, it has to be very accurate and very self-explaining. So all your assessment is going to be done based on that. Yes, your qualification does play a part, but the CDR reports are the most important part of this application. Now, also, Engineers Australia takes plagiarism or copying the content from online sources or someone else's work very seriously. They take it very, very, very seriously. So, if you are applying for under the non-accredited pathway, under CDR pathway basically, then please make sure that you do not copy any content from online sources or your friends or someone's CDR report where they have already submitted those reports to Engineers Australia. Because if you are if you do that, and if you are considered, or if your plagiarism check comes up and says yes, it's been copied from online sources or someone else's work, you can be rejected for this skills assessment, as well as can be imposed 12 months ban for not being able to apply for another assessment for next 12 months, which is obviously going to affect your eligibility to apply for PR, and you don't really want to end up there. So generally we do recommend people to make sure that they do not copy their content from online sources. And all the applicants need to meet under the non-accredited qualification pathway. They need to meet the English language requirement. Now, if the applicant has completed bachelor's degree or higher or master's degree of at least 2 years in Australia, then they do not have to meet the English language requirement. They can request for a waiver. Generally, the waiver is approved. However, Engineers Australia do reserve right to reject the request for waiver and ask for English language score. Now, if someone has, let's say if the applicant does not have the master's degree, which is 2 years, then they have to show that they hold a competent English by providing IELTS, TOEFL or PTE result. PTE was not accepted so far. They have just started accepting it from 1st of November onwards. Now, I hope this helps all the engineers about getting the assessment. Now we will move forward with VetAssess. So VetAssess is the assessment body for general occupations, as we've discussed before. Now VetAssess's requirement is quite straightforward and it's quite easy to understand, and it's just one single criteria for pretty much all the occupations. However, the work experience requirement can be more depending on whether your degree is highly relevant or not to the nominated occupation, but that's not available for each and every occupation. General requirement for the skills assessment with VetAssess is that you have to have a diploma or degree, whatever it says for your occupation. For example, let's say if it is customer service manager, then it's a diploma level occupation, so that means you need the diploma. Or if you're, let's say, applying for a marketing specialist, then it's a bachelor's level qualification. It requires at least a bachelor's or higher qualification in related field, then you need the bachelor's. So depending on the occupation, VetAssess tells you. So there is a simple search function on their website. Simply you select your or search for your occupation. Whatever it comes up, whether they need a degree or diploma, it will tell you there, as well as the applicant has to have at least 1 year work experience after the qualification. So it has to be a post-qualification work experience. The work experience during the qualification may not be considered. Now, how do we prove this work experience? Is obviously the applicant needs to provide the letter, similar to what we need in ACS, Australian Computer Society. They also need a letter providing details of when did you start, when did you complete the work, what was your occupation during your work, and what duties you performed during that time, how many hours you worked. It requires you to work minimum 20 hours per week for the positive skill assessment for at least 1 year. If any work that you've done for less than 20 hours per week cannot be considered for the skills assessment for VetAssess. Now moving forward, we will move forward for a skills assessment with NMAC, which is a registration body or assessment body for nurses. All the nursing occupations or medical occupations such as the registered nurse or midwives can be assessed by NMAC. Now NMAC's requirement is quite straightforward. They have two options basically. One is a full assessment and the modified assessment. Generally most of the applicants are qualifying for modified assessment. Therefore we are only discussing about modified skill assessment for now. So to be able to apply for a skill assessment under the modified assessment, The applicant needs to have a registration in Australia, so they must be registered as a nurse or midwife with AHPRA, which is AFRA, which is the registration body for nursing occupations. And also, if the applicant is, this is the only requirement basically if you are not registered overseas at all. But if the person has completed an initial qualification overseas and if they are registered overseas, they need to provide an evidence that they have at least 3 months work experience as a nurse in last 5 years. Uh, this has been recently added. It was not there before, so please ensure that if you are applying for a skill assessment and if you are as a nurse and if you have been registered before in your country of origin or any other country overseas, then you would need to provide a 3 months work experience. But if someone completes a bachelor's degree in Australia, they don't really need any work experience. As soon as they get their registration, they can go ahead and apply for a skill assessment and NAC. Moving forward to the last assessment body that we would be discussing today is the Trades Recognition Australia. It's actually the body which assesses the trades occupation. TRA does have 3 pathways to apply for a skill assessment, and generally most of the people go for a migration assessment depending on their visa categories again. So how it's going to go is a migration assessment, job ready program pathway, and the offshore skill assessment. Now we will discuss each and every assessment pathways in detail. So migration assessment usually requires you to have at least certificate 3 or 4, depending on what occupation you are applying. The qualification requirement changes. Let's say if you are applying for a cook, you only need certificate 3, but if you are applying as a chef, you need certificate 4. And if you are applying for, let's say, child care center manager, then you might need diploma as well. So depending on what you have studied or what occupation you are applying for, these qualification requirements changes. However, the work experience requirements is same for all the occupations basically, which is 3 years full-time work experience after the qualification. Now, if someone has worked part-time, then that work can be considered equivalent to a full-time. So let's say, for example, if someone has worked 1 year part-time is 6 months full-time. So, and then they can consider that time to be able to apply for a skill assessment. But then you need at least 3 years full-time work experience, and if someone does not have full-time work experience, then it's like 6 years part-time basically, and this has to be after the qualification is gained. The work experience before the qualification or during the qualification cannot be considered for the assessment. Also in migration skill assessment, the applicant will need to have at least 1 year work experience in last 3 years. So the requirement is qualification, which is certificate 3, 4 or diploma, and 3 years work experience, and out of these 3 years, at least 1 year has to be within last 3 years. So 12 months work experience has to be in last 3 years, and all this work experience has to be related to the normative occupation. Now, also at the same time, TRA also requires you to provide employment reference letter, payslips, bank statements, PAYG, as many documents as you can, because TRA generally does not come back and request for the documents. They might simply finalize your application based on the information that you provide. So it's always recommended that all the applicants should provide their documents beforehand with TRA and submit all the relevant required documents to TRA as soon as with the application itself basically. Now moving forward to another assessment type, which is job ready program. So under the job ready program, the applicants who are on student visa here usually go for this because they are the one who can probably complete this anyways. So how it's going to work under the job ready program skill assessment. So the applicant will first need to apply for a provisional skill assessment once they complete their certificate 3 or certificate 4, and then complete at least 360 hours of work experience or vocational placements, which is the part of their course. If the vocational placement is not the part of the course, then this unpaid work cannot be counted, which is a vocational placement. So it has to be a part of your course if you're using a unpaid work experience for 360 hours to get a provisional skill assessment. Now, once the applicant gets the 360 hours work experience, certificate 3, they can apply for a provisional skill assessment or certificate 4, depending on what occupation you choose. Let's take an example. So if someone wants to apply for a skill assessment as a chef, then the person has to have at least certificate 4 and then have at least 360 hours of work experience paid, or a vocational placement as a part of their course for 360 hours. Both can be counted. Now once they have that, they can apply for the provisional skill assessment Once this provisional skill assessment is granted, then the applicant needs to have a full-time work rights. So generally, people who complete certificate 3, 4 and diploma in Australia, in let's say for example in commercial cookery, they can apply for a 485 visa, which is a skill graduate visa, which is usually granted for 18 months, so that they can complete the job ready program. Now the stage 2 of the job ready program is to register yourself for a JRP. Now once you register, you get 12 months from that day, and the applicant has to have full-time work rights, as they will need to complete 1725 hours of work between 12 to 18 months. So minimum 12 months you can take, maximum you can take is 18 months. You need to complete 1725 hours in that time. Once the applicant completes that, once the applicant completes minimum 50% of the required hours, which is 861 hours, then they can choose to go for the job ready workplace assessment, so the TRA officer can come down and see whether you're working at an appropriate skill level or not. Once you complete the workplace assessment, and once the applicant completes 12 months, and then once the applicant completes the 1725 hours of work, then the applicant can go ahead and request for a final outcome letter, which is their skill assessment. And this skill assessment or this letter can be used for the permanent visa application. So it's quite straightforward and very much in line. So simply complete your certificate 3, 4 in commercial cookery, let's say for where we are taking the example of chef. So certificate 3, 4 and then diploma. Combine this, you have completed 2-year study, but it has nothing to do with your provisional skill assessment. So as long as you have certificate 4 and 360 hours of work experience, you apply for a skill assessment, provisional skill assessment. Once the provisional skill assessment is granted, and then you apply for a surplus 485 visa, which is a skill graduate visa, and then during that time you can complete your job ready program. So register yourself saying that I'll be working there. Also, you'll be writing journals online during this time, whole 1 year. In complete 12 months of work minimum. In that 12 months, you have to complete 1725 hours of work. Complete the job ready workplace assessment, where the TRA officer will come down and check whether you are working at an appropriate skill level or not. And once you complete that, then you can request for a job ready final outcome basically. So and that later can be used to apply for the skill visa. Now the last option that they have under the TRA provision, which is offshore skill assessment. Now offshore skill assessment is not available for each and every country, and offshore skill assessment is not only done by TRA. TRA has also contracted VetAssess, Victoria University and William English for their assessment for offshore skills assessment program. Now how it works is pretty much quite identical to the migration assessment. However, it's only available to certain countries and certain occupations. So TRA has the list where, let's say for example, cook has, if you're applying for a cook, if you are from certain countries, then you have to go for a offshore skill assessment. You cannot go for a migration skill assessment. Now the requirement is quite similar as I mentioned. So the applicant has to have certificate 3 or 4 and 3 years full-time work experience, and at least 1 year work experience has to be within last 12 minimum 12 months of work experience has to be within last 3 years. So basically the applicant has to have at least the qualification and the 3 years work experience full-time or equivalent part-time. Now if the person does not have a relevant qualification, and if the person gained an Australian qualification by RPL, which is recognized prior learning, then the applicant can have 6 years work experience and get the RPL certificate, and then get the skills assessment as in their then nominated occupation, in any of the trade occupation basically. So let's take an example of that, which is a quite good thing to discuss. So let's say someone has worked in their home country and never studied about this course, which is, let's say, motor mechanic. Now someone has worked 6 years as a motor mechanic back home, and then they came to Australia to study something, and while studying they realized, oh, I can apply for a skills assessment as a motor mechanic. Now what they need to do is they need to get an RPL certificate first, get an RPL certificate, as well as they have 6 years work experience to gather all the documents to apply for skill assessment. And both together, now because your RPL is issued now in Australia and your work experience is before the qualification, but then this is allowed in this case. So you can have the work experience before you gain the RPL qualification, because you did not study this qualification. Now if you have certificate 3 or 4 or above qualification, and 3 years work experience, or let's say 6 years work experience. If you do not have the qualification and you got a qualification under the RPL, then 6 years, and then apply for a skill assessment. Once you get that, that is your assessment outcome letter, and then you can use that outcome letter to apply for a skill visa. Now this is all about today's skills assessment bodies. Now if you do have any questions about any of the assessment process, or if you're not able to understand the assessment process for any of the skills assessment bodies that we have discussed so far, you can drop your questions under the comment box, and we will endeavor to answer those questions as soon as we can. We thank you very much for watching us tonight, and we look forward to see you again. Thank you.